Here I have £50 worth of new Charles III pound coins. And if I take one of them out and put it next to this one, you can see that he's looking at his mum. And today, I'm going to tell you why. Inspired by the new coinage of Charles III, I'm going to be talking you through the last 500 years of portraits on the coins of English and lastly British monarchs. I selected this range because, after all, I only had an afternoon for filming. So, if I was sat at home watching this video, I might at this point be asking myself a few questions. For example, why is the presenter wearing a jumper that matches the background colour and the colour of the fabric rack board the coins are displayed on? Was that deliberate? Well, I can answer, no it wasn't. I might also be asking myself, doesn't the British Museum have a coin of every English monarch in its collection? If so, why aren't you showing all of them? Well, we're starting with Henry VII for two reasons. Firstly, Henry VII is the first English monarch to be portrayed on a coin in profile, rather than face on. Also, coins minted prior to Henry VII aren't exactly recognisable as portraits of monarchs. They're more placeholders, if you like. Take a look at these coins of Henry I to Henry VI. They're more or less indistinguishable from each other if we're looking purely at the portraits alone. They make for a terrible game of Guess Who. And before you can say, well, I can tell the difference, well, no, you can't, because that's not the right order. This is the right order. Oh, wait, I'm confusing myself. No, that's not the right order either. See, indistinguishable. Moving along, we come to a coin of Henry VIII. It was struck towards the latter part of his reign. Actually, for this coin, he reverts to the front-facing profile. However, it remains representative. He's quite jowly in this image. Henry was notorious for having debased the currency. He adulterated it with various impurities in order to stretch out the supply of precious metal, which meant that when these coins from the latter part of his reign went into circulation and became rubbed, they actually rubbed away the higher profile bits to reveal the base metal underneath, hence the rather unaffectionate nickname for Henry by this point, Old Coppernose. Moving along, we see a gold coin of Edward VI, the boy king, shown in this rather unusual three-quarter side profile portrait. For the reign of Queen Mary I, I've chosen this coin here, but she's actually facing her husband, King Philip of Spain. So you've got an English queen and a Spanish king portrayed together on the same coin. It's interesting to think that a generation later, during the reign of Elizabeth I, by which time Mary has died, Philip has proposed to Elizabeth and been rejected, and then a couple of years later, the Spanish go to war with the English. So you've got here an English queen married to a Spanish king, to here, the English at war with Spain. On to James I. To be totally honest, this one's pretty boring. James I has made himself look like a Roman, and to help this look, he's wearing a laurel. So the coin is called a laurel. That's kind of about it. This coin is unusual in all sorts of ways. As you can see, it's pretty hefty. Fits just about in the palm of my hand, but it's quite a heavy piece. And this is a pound weight in silver. So you could argue that it's the first pound coin. It's worth 240 pennies and it therefore weighs the same as 240 pennies. Actually, compared to all of these other coins, it's one of the few coins that wasn't struck by the Royal Mint. It was struck at Charles I's Oxford Mint. This is the Civil War period between 1642 and 1644, when he had satellite mints around the country because he didn't have access to the Royal Mint. The obvious disadvantage to this coin is that it's big and heavy. It probably wouldn't sit comfortably in a pocket. However, the advantage is that being so much bigger than the average coin, there's enough space for both King Charles and his lovely horse. Whoa, whoa. Moving on, we come to a coin of Oliver Cromwell. It's unclear if these coins actually entered circulation and were used as currency. It might have just been a piece that was struck for collectors or as a commemorative piece. So after the Restoration, Charles II issues coins that look a little bit like this. in his reign. We also see the first guineas, which are being struck in gold. And I mention that because if we look at this coin here, so this is a coin now of James II, we can see that there's a little elephant and castle below the portrait. So this is being struck from gold that is being imported by the Royal Africa Company, just as the guineas were struck using that gold, hence the name guinea. Moving on, we see a coin of William and Mary, showing their busts side by side, representing their joint reign. It reverts to the single profile after her death. And then we've got this coin of Queen Anne here. And if I turn this over, you see that actually it's the same portrait on both sides. This is a minting error. So this is a mule that's been erroneously created by striking two obverse or portrait dies onto the same piece of metal. Something that's very popular with collectors, but of not huge interest numismatically. And now we're on to the gorgeous Georgians. So George I, not much of note here. George II, or here. George III, this is a Cartwheel penny struck by Matthew Bolton's Soho Mint in Birmingham. So the Royal Mint briefly lost the contract for the production of the coinage. And just like this coin here weighs 240 silver pennies, this coin is struck at a pennyweight in copper, hence its large size. It was nicknamed a cartwheel owing to that size, and there are stories of shopkeepers not liking them because they actually were so heavy that they broke the tills and the cash boxes that they had in their shops. Here we see a double sovereign of George IV. And if I turn it over, you see a design that's still used on the sovereign today, showing Benedetto Pistrucci's design showing George defeating the dragon. There's a story that goes that Pistrucci based the design of George on a waiter he encountered at a restaurant in Leicester Square. This coin shows William IV, and actually the British Museum has one of the original drawings for this coin. It was done by a man called Francis Leggett Chantry, and he used something called a camera lucida, which I've never actually seen in operation, but I imagine it's like some 19th century version of an overhead projector in which you project someone's silhouette onto a piece of paper and then draw the outline. But actually, when it comes to most of these coins, we have very little in the way of designs or models for them. Indeed, I don't think there are any drawings for any of these coins prior to this one. Moving on, this is a £5 gold coin of Queen Victoria, issued not for circulation, this was really purely for collectors. If I turn it over, you can see this rather interesting scene showing Queen Victoria again, this time as the character from Spenser's 1590 poem, The Fairy Queen. She's Una, and she's here leading the lion. Now the story goes that Una is on a quest looking for her parents who have been kidnapped and held hostage by a dragon, and on her quest she meets a lion, and the lion's first response is to look at Una and go, lunch. But then he's captivated by her beauty and agrees to become her protector on this quest. Interestingly, the poem was published during the reign of Elizabeth I. Elizabeth I was sent the poem. There's no evidence that she actually read it. It's quite long. But she did grant its author a pension of £50 per year, which in today's terms is a ton of money. Possibly the reason is because it is an allegory for the fight between the Protestant and Catholic churches in the 16th century. So Una is the defender of the Protestant faith, while one of the characters, Duessa, she defeats, represents the Catholic Church and is probably a metaphor for Mary, Queen of Scots, who meets a similar end by beheading. So from lion taming, we come to this coin. I have nothing interesting to say about this coin. It's Edward VII. It's beautiful, it's lovely. We'll leave it at that. Moving on though, this is a piece of numismatic trivia. It's a 1933 penny. So it's a coin of George V, and I selected this one because 1933 pennies are notoriously scarce. The Mint basically didn't need to produce any pennies in 1933, and so the few that were struck went under the foundation stones of buildings and or went to museums such as the British Museum. So this is our example, so I included that just for fun really. Now, if you were paying particular attention during this video, you'd have noticed something curious that happens, a pattern from this coin onwards. And that is that the portrait starts to alternate. Here, for example, it's facing left, here it's facing right, left, and so on and so forth. It has been tradition since the 17th century for the coinage portrait of English or British monarchs to alternate from left to right. Now, the story goes that Charles II, after the Restoration, was symbolically turning his back on Oliver Cromwell and deliberately had his portrait face the other way. And like all great stories, there is absolutely no evidence whatsoever to support it. Until we get to here, where you've got George V, a left-facing portrait. So, the story goes that Edward VIII disliked his right-facing portrait photo so intensely that he stipulated that his coin portrait had to face left, thus breaking centuries of tradition. So the problem here then is that you've got tradition being broken. You've got this left-facing portrait and then this left-facing portrait, and indeed this left-facing portrait.
However, Edward VIII abdicated from the throne less than a year after becoming king. As such, his coins never made it into circulation, and those that had been struck were melted down. As a result, they're incredibly rare.
So if we acknowledge that this coin actually never made it into circulation, therefore the public never saw it, therefore, if I put my finger over it like that, we can see that normal order is restored, because it's going left, maybe right, who knows, no one's ever going to know, and then back to left again, and thus the pattern continues. Representing the reign of Elizabeth II, I've selected this penny from the start of her reign. We've actually got one of the original plaster models for this coin, designed by someone called Mary Gillick, and the Mary Gillick archive is now in the British Museum, and this is a plaster model for that coinage that would then be cast as what we call an electrotype with a metallic surface and then put into a machine called a reducing machine, which then reads the surface of the coin and reproduces it in miniature. It ensures the quality across the coinage is consistent, because after all, you can get this portrait and you can scale it down to any size you want. So it could be on a penny or a halfpenny or whatever. Now, this innovation comes in around about here in our coinage chronology during the reign of Charles II. And you can see a step change in the quality of the coinage. These are hammered coins, they're produced by hand, not machine, and the engraving is not done by reducing machine, it's done at scale by the engraver. Had been done for thousands of years previously. And of course the problem with that is that if you have your die and it then wears out, you have to go and engrave another die from scratch, and you have to do it at scale, which is very, very hard on the eyes. So this invention of the reduction machine did away with all that. It meant that you could just keep going back to the plaster models in order to create new coins when the die breaks. Doesn't matter what the die is made from, when we're talking about, they don't last forever. Generally a die would last for about 10,000 coins. And finally we have a pound coin of Charles III. This was delivered to us yesterday by the Royal Mint Museum. So I've only just got my hands on these. In fact, they've delivered a whole load more to us. Now, the business of designing coins is as much about preserving tradition as breaking it. One innovation we can observe on the back of the coins of Charles III is these scenes of wildlife and plant life, in a break from previous traditions, for example, which showed allegorical figures such as Britannia.
So that was a trot. No canter, no gallop through the history of English monarchs on coins from Henry VII to Charles III. Now, Charles III coins aren't currently in wide circulation, but if you're in London, we've just put on a display of the new coinage in collaboration with the Royal Mint Museum. Do come by the British Museum if you're in the area. If you were to be immortalised on coins, what would you choose? As for me, I think I'd rather stick with this dashing steed. Come on, Bucephalus, away with us! You're not the main attraction, you know.